With Left to Die, you guys got together back in 2022 as like a tribute to Death. Were you guys always thinking about recording material, or did that come up later whenever you saw the fans' reaction to what you guys were doing?
We really didn't discuss it too much. We talked about it a little bit at the very beginning, and then people kept asking about it. Really, are you guys gonna do anything? Are you gonna write songs? Are you gonna do this? Are you gonna do that? And it's like, well, seeing as how we're playing, our first tour cycle, we did Leprosy in its entirety. Obviously, we have half of that lineup in the band, hence why we were playing those songs. And I kind of felt like whatever we came up with was going to get measured against, Leprosy, or maybe From Beyond, like all-time death metal classics. And I thought that was a yardstick I didn't really want to get compared to, So finally, we figured out a thing that would work, which is what became Initiative Mortis. All these digging up all these old tracks and breathing a little new life into them.
Your new album drops tomorrow, July 17th on Relapse Records. Whose idea was it to record some of those earlier Montas and Death songs?
We kind of joked about doing some of them for a while. So it was kind of in the air, but in the ether. But I didn't get any specific ideas until I was doing press for the last Gruesome album, Silent Echoes. I was speaking to a dude in Belgium, and I want to say his name was Steven, but I cannot remember, and I feel like I can't remember, because we did a cover of Legion of Doom with Gruesome, and he was saying how much he enjoyed it because, all the early songs, there's only these like boombox recordings available of them. And he's like, I'd really love to hear something more like that. Have you ever thought about that? And I was like, no, I haven't, but please don't publish this question, because that's a really good idea. And so I messaged everybody and I was like, hey, here's a thought. And yeah, here we are.
How did you guys wind up being able to learn? Did you just learn those songs by ear, or were there any kind of like tabs anywhere? How did that happen?
Well, I figured them out by ear, by and large. Luckily, Rick was there while all this stuff was, being worked on. It was him and Chuck and Cam. And, back then they were like literally, it was like a high school band, so it was very collaborative. Of course, it was also 40 years ago or whatever. So it wasn't like he just remembered all the riffs, There was definitely times when I was like, does it go like 2-3-2-3, or is it 3-2-3-2 kind of thing, And he would be like, no, I think it was this way, and every once in a while he would be like, no, it was definitely this, because, and then he'd go into some very charming story about, sitting on Chuck's bed at his house, eating cereal and like, arguing about which riff to use or whatever, which is really very endearing, But yeah, no, I mostly just went through my ear and, pieced it together.
Over the last few years, there seems to be a resurgence of attention on Death, and they seem to be more popular than ever. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, the resurgence in some respects is due to basically getting the catalog sorted out with the estate. I know before Eric Greif, who was the longtime Death manager, I know before he passed away, he kind of brokered the deal between Schuldiner Estate and Relapse to kind of get the whole catalog back in press, except for, was it Symbolic? Because Symbolic, I think, was on Relative. No, Symbolic was on Roadrunner. Anyway, whatever. There's something different about that album business-wise, and that's why it hasn't been reissued. But once Relapse got the rights to the catalog, obviously they were, quite keen to to repress everything and get everything, back in circulation. But I think during their heyday was one of the bigger death metal bands, so it wasn't like, people had forgotten about them. And there's always something kind of romantic when somebody's story gets cut off in the middle like that, whether it's Randy Rhoads or Cliff Burton or, take your pick. The fact that Chuck was able to accomplish so much in the time that he had, I'll always sort of be wondering, like, what would he have done? Who knows? Would he have ever come back to this stuff or done another like pure death metal album? Who knows? Would he have just done Control Denied? And we just don't know. So I think that is, there's a lot of allure to that kind of myth making, the tragic rock myth making. It's just part of the culture of broader rock fandom. Chuck being the sort of standard bearer for death metal in the early days, especially. He was a guy people talked about, even when he was alive, a lot, as being an innovator and a trailblazer and all that stuff. And of course, that only I was singing the quote that Lemmy said about Randy Rhoads. He's like, Randy was a great guitar player, and of course, after he died, he got even better. And this was like, that is the most concise way to encapsulate that phenomenon. So yeah, but it's great. I mean, Death's one of my favorite bands. Without Death, my style as a guitar player, I'm sure, would be vastly different, because I learned so much from those early records.
Is this going to be the only album you guys are planning to put out, or is there going to be any original material? Or
we don't really. This band doesn't really plan. It's actually like something that I really enjoy about doing this. Beyond obviously being a huge Death fan and playing all these songs, which are so near and dear to my heart, but we don't really have like a big agenda. Like, we never had a manager, or we never had anything fancy, particularly organizational. We just were like, hey, do you think maybe people might want to see us do some shows? And then they did, and so we kept doing more, and then people kept asking us to record, if we were going to record something or whatever, and then on a good idea, and so we did that. And beyond that, there's no plans, but who knows? We'll see.
It's been the best part of touring with these songs and playing this music to people that may have never had a chance to hear it played live before?
I mean, it's really like, I do really feel very privileged and extremely fortunate that, I get to go out and play, like I said, some of my favorite songs with the original guys. That's like, you wouldn't even think of that as a thing, as a fan growing up. So, I personally, I get a lot of enjoyment off every gig, and especially I really, I love playing sort of the deeper cuts that Death didn't play live back in the day, or at least I didn't see, and I started seeing Death in 1990 on the Spiritual Healing tour cycle, but doing stuff like, Regurgitated Guts or Primitive Ways, Choke on It, some of these lesser heralded songs, that brings me a lot of pleasure. I am a fan, and I'm able to sort of do fan service. So I'm servicing myself as a fan. You can take that as a euphemism for whatever. But it is great. Like every night we meet kids who were like, yeah, I never saw Death live, or I was just a child, or not even born yet in some cases when Chuck died. And so they're seeing how much this music still means to these people. That's really special, and it's something that, on one hand, I'm having a great time, like, make no mistake, I'm like enjoying myself to the fullest. But I mean, I do, feel responsibility to do right by the material, and to, do the best I can, and show up every day and be ready to, when we're on tour, obviously, show up every day and be ready to give 100% and not phone it in, because I'm incredibly lucky to be here. And, that's the whole, I don't know, I guess it's the whole moral of Chuck's story, right? Life ends so fast, so take your chance and make it last. So it's like, that's what I'm trying to do.
You've been in a couple of different Death tributes over the years. Did Left to Die come out of those Death to All tribute shows, or was this something separate?
Basically, yes, but it was sort of a circuitous road to get there. I did the first Death to All tour because Stefan from Obscura, there was an issue with his visa, so I ended up, stepping in at the absolute last minute, got thrown in the deep end. And then Gus, our drummer, and I, we were talking when Exhumed played with Death to All. We were saying how we would love to see more emphasis on the older stuff, and see getting guys like Terry and Rick and James Murphy and Chris Ryford and stuff involved, and that was sort of the original thought before Gruesome. Obviously, that we kind of flew that up the flagpole and nobody saluted, so I kind of jokingly was like, I'll just write some Death songs, why not? And then so how Gruesome got rolling, 10 years ago, basically years later, we sort of come full circle back to the original idea. Gus and I got tapped to do a gig with Terry and James Murphy to play Spiritual Healing, all front to back. And then that led to Rick being like, I wonder if those guys would want to do something like that with Leprosy. And that's how Left to Die got started. And it just sort of has snowballed out of control. You know, it's not, I mean, I love Death. I'm a huge fan. And I'm, like I said, I'm very excited to be part of pushing that legacy forward, you know, in some small way or whatever. But, you know, it wasn't like I set out to do, you know what I mean? This all sort of kind of just one thing led to another. And then, you know, here I am making a record with Terry and Rex. So I don't know.
Are there any other bands you think deserve to have this kind of a tribute, man? Like old school bands?
I mean, I feel like they're,
Most of them are still around, you know?
yeah, you know, I mean, I think what they did, they have a thing for Bathory that I know some of the Watain guys and I think some of the Dissection guys do in Europe, which is pretty cool because obviously not only is Quorthon deceased, but like Bathory never even really played live. I think they have like some people see them rehearse and then, you know, it's a solo project. So I think that's kind of cool to see that because that's, I love Bathory and to see those songs live would be huge. I'm glad that Tom Warrior kind of, I don't know if it was Martin Ains' death or what, but I'm glad that he's embracing going back and doing some of the Hellhammer stuff and stuff that he's doing. Yeah, I feel like, you know, metal has a unnaturally long lifespan and most of the bands in metal have an unnaturally long lifespan. You know, you think about like what the Beatles were around for 8 years. That's like one Metallica record and a tour cycle, you know. So yeah, I don't know, metal just seems to endure in a weird way. Yeah.
Where did you guys get to record the record?
We recorded it separately. Gus has his own recording studio in Florida down by Fort Lauderdale. I have our studio here that we built with Exhumed. I mean, we didn't like build the building, but you know, we put the studio together. That's where I'm at the moment. So really, you know, for us to record stuff is really easy. It's just literally like, oh, I'm here every day anyway. Like, cool. Let's track some guitars. Then Rick had a buddy of his who has a studio out near Orlando, and then Terry's schedule with Obituary is so crazy. I think he just did a DI into a digital audio workstation, you know, somewhere on tour with Obituary. And we've been doing this for a while, so it's not, I wouldn't recommend that as the way to record necessarily, but like I said, we've been doing this for a while, so it was pretty easy to just slot everything together. And you know, we've worked with Matt LaPlante, the engineer Gus and I have for a few years as well, and he's great. So I knew that we'd be able to make it work, you know.
You've been in Exhumed since 1990. Did you ever get to play shows or tour with Death back in the day?
No, funnily enough, back in the early 90s, late 80s, there was pay to play was a big thing in the Bay Area where I grew up, where, you know, you'd get X number of tickets and you'd have to come up with Y number of dollars and you could sell the tickets, or, you know, if you couldn't sell the tickets, you still had to pay. So all of, you know, our high school after school jobs, that's like what that paid for would be to get on these gigs. And we were playing a show at a long defunct venue called the Omni, and this band, I can't remember what they were called, doesn't really matter. They kept playing past their cutoff time, and they were supposed to be the local pay to play opener for Death this would have been January 92 or December 91, somewhere around then. Or anyway, because they wouldn't get off stage and they were being dicks about it, the venue was like, these guys, we're not giving them the Death show. And we were just literally the other local band on this bill. They just turned and be like, hey, you guys want to play with Death? We're like, yeah, of course we do. And so you would call them and you'd go down to the office to pick up the printed tickets so you could sell to your friends at school or whatever. We called, you know, they were supposed to call, and they said, well, that tour actually got canceled. We have these other 2 death metal shows. Like, they didn't really know who the bands were. They're like, you guys, why don't you guys do this Autopsy show and this Cannibal Corpse show instead? And we're like, okay,
I guess.
Yeah, that was in January of 92. And those were sort of our first 2, you know, real shows with actual like people in attendance and stuff. Because Death canceled. Yeah.
Speaking of Exhumed, how did you guys wind up on the Eric and Andre show?
Much like how I got the Death All gig, Eric Andre wanted Pig Destroyer, but because of logistics, that was not possible. So the label contacted me and they're like, you guys are in California, you're not that far from LA. Can you do this? And I was like, yes. I didn't, I had no idea. Like, drummer was living in Florida. He was in Florida at the time. And our guitar player, I forget why he couldn't do it, but I was just like, yes, it's TV. Like, we're saying yes. Like, we're going to figure it out. And we had to kind of cobble together a live lineup. But I kind of am of the mindset that anytime you can get exposure in a broader sense, you should take every single chance you can get, because like people forget Cannibal Corpse's career really took off because of it, Ace Ventura. And so if you can break into that broader culture, that can only help the profile of your band.
You play guitar for Cold Slither, a G.I. Joe themed band based on a band from the episode Cold Slither. How did you get involved with that?
Well, Gus and I, worked together for a long time in Gruesome, and we have a pretty good, we have pretty complementary skill sets, and, we get along. And he is a massive, like, G.I. Joe nerd. I'm more of like a Marvel DC nerd, but there's a lot of overlap there. And we're both 80s kids. And Gerardo from Reigning Phoenix is a huge G.I. Joe guy. Gus works with Gerardo in Malevolent Creation, and Gerardo, because did like the Kerry King album and stuff, so he's sort of swimming in bigger ponds than certainly I am. He, had been bugging Hasbro to do something with Cold Slither. He's like, I make metal albums for a living. I run a record label. Let's make a record. Let's do this. And the 40th anniversary of the episode came, and they're like, okay, cool. This is the time. Like, you wanted to make a record, and so Gerardo called Gus. Gus called me, and next thing you know, we're coldly slithering back to San Diego Comic-Con next week.
Is that kind of how you got in? Because when I was doing some research for this, I saw you had a band called Knights of Unicron, and I was like, there's no way. And then I saw... After we did the Cold Slither record, and Hasbro liked working with us, and Gus has done some other, like piecemeal stuff for them when they needed music or whatever. They like working with Gerardo on music projects, and we're all nerds as well as being able to play and record and all that. And so with the 40th anniversary of the animated movie, Hasbro wanted to re-record the whole soundtrack, which is a great soundtrack. Gerardo's like, well, I got my team in place, so we just went to work, and I was a huge fan of the original album, so it was a really fun project.
With all of your bands, it feels like you jump around different genres. With Decapitator, you go into thrash metal. Pounder is more of a straightforward metal band. Left to Die is old school death metal. How difficult is it to jump from genre to genre?
I don't find it terribly difficult. I find it more sort of stimulating than anything, as much as like Exhumed's like I've been my band since high school. It's like basically a high school band that's sort of lost control and just keeps going somehow. I think if I was just doing that, I would be, it wouldn't be as satisfying without being able to do other stuff. Or I think we would have ended up diluting the music by bringing in these other influences that we're interested in. And I don't really want to do that,
Infamously, Exhumed doesn't use a double bass pedal. Was that something you went into the band knowing would be a stylistic choice, or did it just naturally happen?
Well, we did when we were starting out. We always had that chain drive double pedal, and then once we got whatever assistant manager positions at our jobs or whatever, then we got a double bass drum kit, and we very much wanted to have that sort of throwback look. Even in the 90s, we were like wanted to look like the 80s, So we wanted big drums, two kick drums. And then, then we made an album called Slaughter Cult that has almost no double bass on it. But and I don't know, we also had like, we got into metal at a time when it seemed like a lot of bands were sort of going more commercial and changing in ways that we didn't like. And so we thought the way to prevent us from wimping out, this is like the logic of a 15-year-old. But was that we would put rules in place. Like we didn't want to use triggers. We wouldn't change our logo. We were going to, we would make sure that we'd have a blast beat in every song because it has to be fast and all this and that. And we haven't stuck to all of them as time has gone on. But yeah, that was kind of
embracing the like no poser mentality.
And then speaking on Exhumed's gore metal, you had said we were still very loose and sloppy and didn't have a handle on recording it all. And listening back to that record, I like most of the songs, but the production is awful sounding. But you remastered it back in 2023.
We did. We actually re-recorded the whole album. Yeah, we re-recorded the whole album about 8 or 9 years ago. Basically, we had some issues not getting into Canada on tour, and then our van engine died on the way home, so we lost like about $15,000-$20,000 on that tour. And I needed to get a new engine, so I had to call out the label, and I was like, I need an advance on something. Like, well, do you have a new record? First, they were like, yes, we'll help you out. We'll help you get the engine. And then they're like, well, do you have a new record? Whatever. And it was like, no. Like, well, maybe we can re-record the first one. And like, okay, yeah, we can do that. And so that was basically, that's sort of what, that was how we decided to do that.
Did you get, I know you had said y'all lost some of the songs during the original recording. Well, when you re-recorded it, did you get to pull any of those songs back?
No. Well, we did record one track later that was on a split 7-inch with Gadget. And it was originally called Pearly Peanut Papules, but we changed the song to Pus Grinder. And then there was 2 other songs that none of us remember how they went. So I don't know. I remember one riff, but I actually ended up reusing that riff. Yeah. So those songs are forever gone somewhere.
Lost to time.
Yep.
If you had to decide, what would you say is the album you were most proud of across your entire career?
I mean, I'm always hoping it's going to be the next one. Right. It's like, but there's definitely, sometimes, you're always trying your best, and sometimes it all comes together, and sometimes it doesn't come together quite as well as you'd hope, but sometimes, like, I think like Horror was a record that we did. It came together real well with Exhumed. Slaughter Cult was a record that came together real well. The first Decapitator album, I think, came together real well. That one's almost by accident. So, it just depends. I think Twisted Prayers by Gruesome came together real nicely.
What do you have planned for the rest of 2026?
Well, Left to Die is going to Europe in 2 weeks, and then we go to Latin America all through September. And then there's some stuff that has not been announced yet, but there'll be some, I'll be keeping myself busy.
Are you listening to any newer bands or toured with any newer bands you think people should check out?
Yeah, I mean, I listened to a lot of newer bands. We played a festival with Caustic Wound earlier this year. I thought they were really, really good. Also, Century from Sweden was on that same festival. One grindcore band, one traditional metal band. I think I'm really excited about the new Devil Master album. The single is great. I mean, it sounds like Devil Master. I think that band's really good. There's a lot of interesting stuff. There's even my little town, we have some pretty good bands. We got Mephitic Corpse and Necropsy Odor and stuff. I think Morgue Breath from LA is like one of the best, like, newer grind death bands or whatever. Yeah, so there's lots of good stuff.
But we got one more question for you from the young man.
This is the big one, boys, for all the marbles. What do we got?
Do you have any advice for the younger kids coming up trying to make a career in music?
Yeah, I have 2 bits of advice. One is that the internet is not real life. People like clicking on and liking or whatever, like that doesn't take any effort. I mean, I like posts that I don't even read tons of times, So I think try to get out of this like data driven mindset of like clicks and engagement and this and that, because ultimately if someone comes to your gig, that's what counts, right? If someone walks in the door, and especially then if they buy something, then it's like, okay, this person is an audience member. This person isn't just somebody that a targeted ad, whatever. So that's a big one. But I think the other thing is that, with the internet age, one of the great things about it is that you can learn so much about playing and all these techniques and stuff that, you just couldn't back when I was a kid, you would buy Guitar World or whatever and hope that maybe they would have a thing about Slayer in there or whatever. Now you can like watch a playthrough of like whatever you want, and there's tabs, and AI will separate the stems out so you can listen to just the bass or whatever you want to do. So the idea that becoming a great, technically proficient player is going to be your biggest asset, I think, is a wrong idea.
obviously you want to try to improve and you want to hone your craft, but at the end of the day, there's the level of musicianship is so much higher everywhere. Like there's kids in high school on YouTube that like play rings around me. So what you can really bring to the table is your own point of view and your own it's like it should be about like, hey, this is what I love about music, and I'll just put that out there. And hopefully, you know, maybe I'm a freak and nobody likes what I like, but I don't think I'm that weird. You know, there's got to be somebody out there who's like, oh, I like that too. That's what gets me excited. And if you build on that, then you're going to have more satisfaction, and you're going to be doing something that's more worthwhile rather than trying to play as good as some dude on YouTube that's never played on stage in his life. So that's all I got.